Imagine if you owned $185 million, a duplex on Park Avenue, and a country estate in the hills above the Hudson. Imagine if you had given away nearly $200 million in your lifetime, and the city of New York thanked you on every library wall. Now, imagine you are 104 years old. You are lying on a torn couch in a stained nightgown. The room smells of dog urine. The heat is off. The phone calls from your closest friends are no longer reaching you. And the man who has locked you inside this room is your only son. If you find the truth behind old money more honest than the legend, subscribe so the next story I dig out finds you waiting for it. Chapter 1. The Marine Commandant's daughter who married at 17. She was the only child of a 4-star Marine and a society beauty, and she was married off to a violent man before her teenage years had finished. Roberta Brooke Russell was born on the 30th of March, 1902 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Her father, John Henry Russell Jr., would later become the 16th Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Her grandfather had been a Rear Admiral. Her mother, Mabel Howard, had been raised on the formal Southern code of pearls and dancing lessons and silent obedience to men. The household into which Brooke was born was sentimental, disciplined, and ambitious. There would be one daughter only, and she would be perfect. She grew up moving. Marine postings dragged the family from port to port, but the longest and most formative stretch was in Beijing, where her father served at the United States Legation between 1910 and 1913. The child Brooke learned the rhythms of a vast walled city, the calligraphy on screens, the silk fans in shop windows, the gardens that lay behind closed gates. She would say for the rest of her life that the eye for beauty she carried into the museums of New York had been formed in Beijing before she was 12. The grown woman who would one day rebuild the Asian wing at the Metropolitan Museum had already started rebuilding it inside her own memory as a small girl. At 15, she came back to Washington. The Russells, like every Marine family, were respectable but not rich. The dancing card, the dinners, the introductions all happened on her father's salary. When she made her debut at 16, she was beautiful, but not heiress beautiful. A man named Dryden Kuser, the son of a New Jersey state senator and the heir to a banking and brewing fortune, took notice. He was 7 years older than her. He drank. He laughed too loud. He proposed in a hurry, and her parents, who saw the door of money opening, told her to walk through it. She married him on the 26th of April, 1919, 3 weeks after her 17th birthday. She would later call the marriage the worst years of her life. He drank harder than anyone had warned her. He hit her. He kept other women. When she became pregnant in late 1923, he became convinced, without evidence, that the child was not his. 6 months into the pregnancy, he beat her so badly that he broke her jaw. She delivered the baby in May 1924. She named him Anthony Dryden Kuser. He was the only child she would ever have. She did not leave for another 5 years. The social code of the time did not permit easy escape. Divorce was a public catastrophe for the woman, regardless of cause. She waited until her son was old enough to be sent to her parents and to nannies. Then she took the train to Reno, Nevada. She filed for divorce on the 15th of February 1930. It was granted later that year. She came back to New York at 28, divorced, with a son she barely knew, an inadequate settlement, and the silent vow that her boy would never grow up knowing that the man whose name he carried was the man who had broken her face. She moved into a small apartment. She started over. It would be 23 more years before she became Mrs. Astor. It would be 80 more before the boy she had handed to her parents in that summer of 1930 came back to collect what he believed she owed him. Chapter 2. The Love That Came Too Late. She spent 12 years rebuilding her life with the only man she ever truly loved, and then a heart attack in 1952 took him in a single afternoon. Charles Henry Marshall was a quiet, attentive man, the only son of a respected Wall Street banker. He worked in finance, but he had no taste for it. What he loved was conversation, books, gardens, and Brooke. She met him in New York in the early 1930s. He courted her gently. He was already in her life as a friend before he became anything else. He never raised his voice. He drank a glass of wine and stopped. He talked to her about Beijing and listened when she answered. They married in 1932. She was 30. He was 41. He had no children of his own, and he treated young Anthony, then 8 years old, as if he had been born to him. The marriage gave Brooke the first ordinary years she had ever had. They lived in a brownstone in Manhattan. They spent summers on Long Island and weekends in the country. Charles encouraged Brooke to write. Her early essays and her first attempts at fiction were drafted in those years. She would later say that she became the person she actually was during the marriage to Charles Marshall. In 1942, on his 18th birthday, Anthony Dryden Kuser walked into the kitchen and asked his mother and his stepfather if he could change his last name. He did not want to carry the name of the man who had broken his mother's jaw. He wanted to carry Charles's name. Brooke and Charles agreed at once. From that day, Anthony Dryden Kuser became Anthony Dryden Marshall, and the name Marshall would follow him through Jima and the Central Intelligence Agency and 3 ambassadorships and a Tony Award, and finally, more than 60 years later, into the dock of a New York criminal courtroom. Anthony enlisted in the Marines at the end of 1942. He was 18 years old. He shipped to the Pacific. On the 19th of February 1945, he came ashore at Iwo Jima with the 4th Marine Division. He was wounded in the assault. He was awarded the Purple Heart. He came home decorated, serious, changed. He had spent the war thinking about a stepfather he loved and a mother whose attention he had never been able to hold. In November 1952, Charles Marshall came home from the office complaining of chest pain. He sat down. He died of a heart attack within the hour. Brooke had been out of the house. She came back to find him gone. She was 50 years old. Anthony was 28, married already to his first wife, working overseas. Brooke stood in an empty Manhattan brownstone in the autumn of 1952, a widow for the first time, and discovered that the social city of New York had no place for a 50-year-old widow without a fortune. The invitations slowed. The phone rang less. The bills did not. She started writing in earnest. She wrote for House and Garden. She wrote magazine pieces about decorating and travel. She made enough to keep the rent paid and the staff fed. She found that grief without money was a private grief that no one wanted to hear about. She had been the wife of a kind man, and now she was a woman in a black dress on a sofa in a quiet apartment, and the city she loved had moved on. Then, in the summer of 1953, a friend introduced her to William Vincent Astor. Chapter 3. The Astor Bargain. In October 1953, she married the richest and unhappiest man in New York, and she did it with her eyes open. Vincent Astor was the great-great-grandson of John Jacob Astor, the German immigrant who had built the largest privately held real estate fortune in 19th century Manhattan. By the 1950s, the family had narrowed to one. Vincent was the last great American Astor. He was the chairman of Newsweek magazine, the owner of vast tracts of New York City real estate, and one of the unhappiest men of his generation. He had been married twice. Both marriages had failed badly. He was difficult. He drank, he sulked, he had a temper. He suffered from depression in an era before depression had a name that anyone would say aloud at dinner. The Astor fortune was old in a way few American fortunes were. John Jacob Astor had arrived from Germany in 1784, made his first money in the fur trade, and converted those profits into Manhattan real estate at a moment when Manhattan was still mostly farmland. By his death in 1848, he was the richest man in America, with an estate of $20 million, an amount that in the size of the United States economy of his day would translate to several $100 billion now. 5 generations later, the surviving Astor real estate, the cash, the trusts, and the personal art collection still amounted to a fortune of around $127 million in 1950s money. There was only Vincent to hold it. The friend who introduced Brooke to Vincent had been honest. Vincent needs a wife who is not afraid of him, the friend said. He needs someone who can manage him. He needs someone with taste. He has money, but no joy. Brooke went into the introduction knowing exactly what she was being offered. She was 51 years old. She was a widow. She had a son working overseas. She had savings that would last another 5 years if she did not slip. She married Vincent Astor in October 1953 at a small ceremony at his estate. She was the 3rd Mrs. Astor. She was the last great Mrs. Astor. The marriage was, by her own private testimony to her closest friends, deeply unhappy. Vincent was emotionally cruel in private. He was bored, he suffered, he drank, he punished her for things she had not done. The novelist Louis Auchincloss, who became her friend in those years, would later remember Brooke telling him that the only way she got through her time with Vincent was by reminding herself that the money would one day be hers, and that with the money she would buy back something of the New York. She did not yet know what. On the 3rd of February 1959, Vincent Astor came home from his office, sat down in his study, and had a heart attack. He was 67. He died within hours. The marriage had lasted 5 years and 4 months. Brooke went out the next morning to the funeral home and gave instructions for the burial in a steady voice. She was now, at 56 years old, the widow of one of the most consequential American fortunes still in private hands. The will was read shortly after. Vincent's estate was valued at $127 million. Brooke received outright $2 million in cash. She received the personal real estate that Vincent had owned in his own name rather than through the Astor companies. She received the income for life on a personal trust fund of approximately $60 million. And, most consequentially of all, she received the presidency of the Vincent Astor Foundation, with assets initially valued at $65 million and a free hand in deciding what to do with them. Vincent had told her once, late in his last summer, that the Astor money had taken too much from New York and not given enough back. He had said the foundation would be hers to put right. He had probably not believed she would do it. She walked out of the lawyer's offices on the afternoon of his funeral with $125 million of giving power and the rest of her life to spend it. She was at the start of her ascent. The dream of redemption opened in front of her like a long avenue. She was about to spend the next 38 years walking down it. Chapter 4. The Woman Who Gave New York Back to Itself. She decided the Astor money would not leave New York, and for 38 years, she made sure it did not. She took control of the Vincent Astor Foundation in the spring of 1959. She did not hire a large staff. She did not move to a corporate office. She ran the foundation out of her Park Avenue duplex with a single secretary and a small team of advisors. She wrote her own letters. She read the grant applications herself. She made her own decisions about who would receive Astor money and who would not. Her reasoning was simple. She said it again and again in interviews across the next 4 decades. The Astor fortune had been made in New York City. It had been built on New York land, in New York shops, by New York workers, in New York banks. It had to go back to New York. There was no debate. There was no special program for New England or Europe. She gave to the city. The list of beneficiaries became, over the decades, the public face of 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s New York philanthropy. The New York Public Library was the single largest recipient of Astor money. Across her tenure, she sent the library tens of millions of dollars, money used to keep the main branch open longer, to expand the reading rooms, to restore the lions on the front steps, to fund staff, to fund acquisitions, to fund readings. She would later say that the New York Public Library was her first love. The Astor Hall that runs along the main entrance carries the family name today because of her. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received millions. The Astor Court inside the Met, the recreated Scholars Garden in the Chinese galleries, was funded by her in the 1970s and remains one of the most beloved rooms in the museum. The Bronx Zoo and the Wildlife Conservation Society received millions. The Pierpont Morgan Library received millions. The South Street Seaport Museum, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, Central Park, the Animal Medical Center, the Cathedral of St. Patrick, the Frick Collection, all of them received Astor money under her hand. By the time she wound down the foundation in 1997, she'd given away more than $195 million. But the giving was not only to the great institutions. She insisted on funding small community-based programs across the 5 boroughs. Homeless shelters in the Bronx, reading programs for children in Brooklyn, soup kitchens, senior citizen centers, shelter beds for women fleeing violent husbands, which mattered to her in a way the staff understood without her having to explain. She would visit personally. She would put on a hat, take the foundation car, and drive to the South Bronx or to East Harlem, or to Bedford-Stuyvesant, and walk into a soup kitchen and ask the manager what was needed. The next week, the check would arrive. The numbers in her later years were as follows: By the early 1990s, the foundation was dispersing roughly $10 million a year. Her personal lifestyle, the duplex at 778 Park Avenue, the 75-acre Holly Hill estate in Briarcliff Manor, the staff of butlers and gardeners and cooks, ran into the high hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. Her income from the personal trust fund covered it easily. She lived well. She also gave more than 10 times what she spent on herself in every year of her widowhood. The press loved her. Society columnists wrote about her parties for 50 intellectuals at the Park Avenue duplex. Her closest friends became, over the decades, the most senior figures in New York culture. Annette de la Renta, the wife of Oscar de la Renta, became her closest friend. David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, the curators of the Metropolitan, the librarians of the public library, the writers and editors of the city, all moved through her drawing room. She had the gift of asking good questions and listening to the answers. She kept track. She remembered who was married to whom, and who had a new book coming out, and which of the curators had been ill. She also became, in those decades, a writer in her own right. Her memoir, Patchwork Child, was published in 1962. Her second memoir, Footprints, came out in 1980. She wrote essays for Vanity Fair and The New Yorker. She published 2 novels. She kept up a correspondence with the British royal family, with the Vatican, with figures from every presidential administration from Eisenhower to Clinton. In 1998, President Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. She was 96 years old. She wore a sober wool suit. She thanked him quietly. She came home to Park Avenue and continued with the day's work. She did not yet know that the second great act of betrayal in her life had already begun. She did not yet know that the man who would empty her apartment, fire her butler, redirect her $60 million away from her libraries and leave her on a couch in a torn nightgown was, at that moment, sitting in his office at the foundation she had built, going through her files. Chapter 5. A Mother Who Did Not Know Her Son. Anthony Marshall built a life of medals and titles and ambassadorships, and his mother gave most of her attention to strangers. He had come back from Iwo Jima, a Marine officer with a Purple Heart. He had married his first wife shortly after the war. He had become a father to 2 sons, Philip and Alexander, in the early 1950s. He had taken a position with the Central Intelligence Agency in the early years of the Cold War, postings that took him to the Middle East and to Eastern Europe in the era when American intelligence was being built out of nothing. In 1969, President Richard Nixon appointed him United States Ambassador to Madagascar. He served 2 years. 3 years later, he was named Ambassador to Trinidad and Tobago, and then to Kenya. He was a serious career diplomat. He was decorated. He was respected. He came home in the mid-1970s and went into theatrical production with his second wife, Thelma. They produced plays on and off Broadway. In 1995, Anthony Marshall received the Tony Award for Best Revival of a Play for the production of Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, starring Brian Dennehy. By every measure of public accomplishment, Anthony Marshall had lived a life that any man could be proud of. He had been a Marine at Iwo Jima at 20. He had been an intelligence officer at 25. He had been an ambassador at 45. He had been a Tony Award-winning producer at 71. He had earned the right to walk into any room in New York and be respected. Yet inside the apartment at 778 Park Avenue, inside the long shaded drawing rooms with the silk wallpaper and the Chinese screens, none of it made any difference. Brooke Astor did not know how to talk to her son. He bored her. He had not become an intellectual. He had not become a writer. He had not become an institution. He had become, in her private estimation, a competent man who lived in her shadow. The friends she gave her dinners for were the editors and curators and writers of the city. The seat next to her was held for Annette de la Renta, or Louis Auchincloss, or David Rockefeller. The seat across from her, when Anthony came to dinner, was held for him with the politeness she would have shown any other guest. He noticed. He could not unnotice. He sat at the small dinners and watched his mother glow at strangers. He went home to his wife and told her about it. He had spent his life trying to be the kind of son she would brag about. He had won every medal and every title within reach. None of it had unlocked the door he had been knocking on since he was 4 years old. The mother who had given him to her parents in the summer of 1930 had never come back to claim him in any way that satisfied him. In 1992, Anthony Marshall, then 68 years old, left his second wife and married Charlene Gilbert. Charlene was 20 years younger than him. She had been the wife of an Episcopal priest. The affair had broken up 2 marriages. Charlene came from modest means. She did not have the education, the social register placement, the references that Brooke Astor's circle expected of a daughter-in-law. Brooke met Charlene. Brooke did not like Charlene. By every account from the people who saw them in a room together, she did not like Charlene from the first afternoon. She thought Charlene had broken up a marriage for money. She thought Charlene was beneath the Astor world. She thought, although she did not say so in public, that her son had finally settled for a woman who needed him because she had to. She made her dislike practical. She told her estate lawyer in conversations across the early 1990s that Charlene was to receive essentially nothing. The position would be expressed clearly in the next will. She would give Anthony enough to live well. She would give the city of New York the rest. She would give Charlene 3 items of personal jewelry and 2 fur coats that had originally been cut for Brooke's own size 6 frame. Anthony knew. Charlene knew. The 2 of them lived for 10 years with the knowledge that the woman who was sitting on $185 million in Park Avenue had decided that almost none of it would reach them. In 2002, Brooke Astor signed the will that made it official. Chapter 6. The will that was meant to be final. In 2002, she signed a will that gave $100 million to charity and left her daughter-in-law a pair of earrings and 2 used fur coats. The 2002 will was the most considered legal document she ever signed. She was 100 years old. She had been at it for 40 years. She had watched the foundation give away $195 million. She knew what was left in her personal estate. She knew the shape of what she wanted to leave behind. The will set out 3 main provisions. The bulk of the estate, in the form of cash, securities, and real estate, would go to charity. The single largest beneficiary was the New York Public Library, with smaller but substantial bequests to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Pierpont Morgan Library, the Bronx Zoo, and a list of named smaller organizations across the 5 boroughs. Anthony Marshall would receive a substantial cash and property bequest, large enough to keep him comfortable for life, but small relative to the charitable share. Charlene Marshall was specifically named in a separate provision. She would receive a necklace, a pair of earrings, and 2 fur coats. The fur coats had been made for Brooke. Brooke wore a size 6. Charlene was much larger. The provision was deliberate. Brooke wanted Charlene to know. Her 100th birthday party was held 3 weeks after she signed the will at the Rockefeller family estate at Pocantico Hills, New York, in March 2002. 220 guests gathered. The guest list was a portrait of late 20th century American public life. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger came. Financier David Rockefeller hosted. Oscar de la Renta dressed her. Annette de la Renta sat beside her. Hillary Clinton, then a United States Senator, came. The president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art came. The director of the New York Public Library came. Editors came. Writers came. The publishers of every great American magazine came. She wore a custom gown of pale blue silk. She wore the pearls that Vincent had given her in 1953. She danced briefly with David Rockefeller. She gave a short speech. The speech was about New York. She thanked the city. She thanked the people who had let her be useful. She did not speak about the fortune in numbers. She spoke about the readers in the New York Public Library. She had brought the receipts to her own party in a different form. She came home to Park Avenue that night and slept in her own bed. She had 2 more good years in front of her, although the friends who saw her closely had already started noticing things. A word forgotten, a name not coming. A glance held a beat too long. Her doctors had been watching it for almost a year. By the end of 2002, they were certain. Alzheimer's disease. The diagnosis was not made public. It was given to the family. It was given to her estate lawyer. It was given to the senior staff at the foundation. It was given to the people who needed to know. Anthony Marshall was given it. Charlene Marshall was given it. Inside the Park Avenue duplex, the lights were starting to go out. Outside, the city she had funded was still putting up plaques with her name on them. The will had been signed. The party had been thrown. The mother had been declared incapable in a quiet conversation with the family doctor. The waiting was over. The taking was about to begin. Chapter 7. The First Codicil. On the 30th of January 2003, with her mother already losing her words, Anthony Marshall sat her down to sign the first of 3 documents that would unmake the will. The first codicil was, on its surface, a modest amendment to the 2002 instrument. It expanded the powers of the executor. It clarified some language about the management of certain properties. It contained nothing that, in isolation, would have raised the eyebrows of a casual reader. What the first codicil did was something quieter. It made Anthony Marshall a more powerful executor of his mother's estate. It expanded what he could do with the assets between the moment of her death and the moment of distribution. It opened a door that the 2002 will had been carefully drafted to keep closed. The lawyer who drafted the codicil was not the lawyer who had drafted the 2002 will. The lawyer who drafted the codicil was a man named Francis Xavier Morrissey, Jr. Francis Morrissey had a long career as a New York and Florida estate lawyer who specialized in elderly wealthy clients. He had a reputation in the New York probate bar. He had previously been censured by the Florida bar for conduct involving a will signed by a dying client. The warning signs were on the public record. Anthony Marshall would later testify that he had hired Morrissey because Morrissey was efficient and because the previous family lawyer, Henry Christensen, had become inconvenient. Brooke Astor, at the time she signed the first codicil, was almost certainly capable of understanding what she was signing. Witnesses at the eventual criminal trial would testify that her cognitive decline in late 2002 and early 2003 was visible but not yet catastrophic. She could still read. She could still hold a conversation. She could still recognize her closest friends. She could not always finish a sentence. She could not always remember what day it was. She was a woman of 100 years old. The pattern of her decline was as one would expect. She signed where she was told to sign. She had been signing what her advisors put in front of her for 50 years. She had no reason to suspect that the man asking her to sign was her son, and the man drafting the document was a stranger with a censure on his record. She wrote her name. The signature on the first codicil was hers. It would be the last one of the 3 that the forensic examiners would later agree she could have written. The first codicil was filed quietly. The friends were not told. The foundation was not told. The other charities were not told. The interior architecture of the estate had begun to shift. Outside, the foundation staff continued to send out small grants. The New York Public Library carried on. The Bronx Zoo carried on. The Dachshund Boise was walked in the afternoons. In the apartment, the second codicil was already being drafted. Yacht Chapter 8. The Stolen $60 million. The second codicil, signed in December 2003, redirected $60 million from the libraries of New York into a single trust controlled by Anthony Marshall. The mechanics were as follows. In the 2002 will, a residual provision of approximately $60 million had been earmarked for distribution among the New York Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Pierpont Morgan Library, the Bronx Zoo, and a list of smaller named institutions. The second codicil rewrote that residual provision. The money would now flow into a trust controlled by Anthony Marshall during his life. On his death, what remained would pass to Charlene. The 2003 Brooke Astor was no longer the woman who had signed the 2002 will. The dementia had progressed across the year. She could not always finish a thought. She did not always know what day it was. She had increasing trouble distinguishing recent events from old ones. Her household staff noticed. The friends who came to see her noticed. Annette de la Renta noticed. Henry Kissinger noticed. The doctors noticed and put it in writing, but she was still being shown documents. She was still being asked to sign. She still trusted that the man holding the pen was her son and would not put anything in front of her that would harm her. The accelerating personal spending in the same months tells the second half of the story. Anthony Marshall used money that he had taken from his mother's accounts to buy himself a yacht. The yacht cost approximately $920,000. He paid himself a salary for managing his mother's affairs that climbed at one point to approximately $2,300,000 in a single year. He fired members of the long-serving Park Avenue household staff. He fired the gardeners at Holly Hill. He cut the food budget. He cut the medical budget. He cut the heat. Then came the safety gate. In the late summer of 2003, The nursing staff at the Park Avenue duplex noticed that the 101-year-old Brooke Astor was unsteady on her feet at the top of the small staircase between the two levels of the apartment. They asked for a safety gate. They estimated that a small wooden gate that would fit the staircase would cost approximately $2,000 to commission and install. Anthony Marshall refused. He said the cost was unnecessary. He said his mother could be helped down the stairs by staff. He said no. The man who had bought himself a $920,000 yacht 3 months earlier refused his mother a $2,000 wooden gate. The staff watched. They noted it. They told the doctors. The doctors began to keep their own private notes. The friends who came less often now because the visits had become difficult to arrange began to compare what they were each hearing. Annette de la Renta sat in the drawing room one Sunday afternoon and watched Brooke Astor try to find the word for tea. She went home and made a phone call to her husband and said the words, "Something is wrong." The third codicil had not yet been written. Chapter 9. The Squalor and the Forgery. By the spring of 2004, Brooke Astor was a 102-year-old woman sleeping on a torn couch in a room that smelled of dog urine, and the third codicil bore a signature she could no longer write. The deterioration of her surroundings happened slowly enough that no single day was visibly worse than the day before. But across the autumn of 2003 and the spring of 2004, the friends who saw her at intervals began to compare notes and to be frightened. The nightgown she wore in the afternoons was the same nightgown she had worn the week before. It was sometimes torn, it was sometimes stained. The room was sometimes too cold and sometimes too hot. The radiators were not always working. The kitchen staff was reduced. The food was simpler than it had been. The phone calls from old friends were no longer always passed through. The visitors were sometimes told that Mrs. Astor was sleeping. The dachshund Boise, who had been her constant companion for years, was still with her in the apartment, but the careful housekeeping that had kept the rooms immaculate for 50 years had thinned. In 2005, Anthony Marshall fired the butler, Christopher Ely. Eli had served Brooke for almost 20 years. She had called him her best friend in public. He had been the one constant warm presence in the apartment. After his firing, she asked for him repeatedly. She was told he had moved away. She was told he was happy elsewhere. None of it was true. He had been fired because he had become a witness to a situation that the son did not want a witness for. He had been fired because he had begun to ask questions of his employer. On the 3rd of March 2004 in the apartment, a document was placed in front of Brooke Astor. It was the third codicil. It made further changes that benefited Anthony and Charlene at the expense of the charities. It bore a signature that purported to be hers. A forensic handwriting examiner would later study that signature in detail at the criminal trial. The examiner would conclude that Brooke Astor's hand could no longer have produced the signature dated the 3rd of March 2004. The deterioration of her motor control had passed the threshold at which the elements of the signature could be assembled. The signature was, in the language the examiner used in court, not consistent with her capability on that date. The jury would later find that the signature had been forged. The man who had done the forging, the jury would find, was Francis Morrissey. In the summer of 2006, the grandson Philip Marshall came to New York. He had not seen his grandmother in some months. He took the elevator to the Park Avenue duplex. He walked through the rooms. He saw the torn nightgown on the couch. He saw the bare patches where furniture had been removed. He saw the food his grandmother was being fed. He smelled the room. He looked at the staff. He sat with her for an hour and tried to talk to her. She did not always know who he was. She did not always know who she was. He went home that night and started to think. He was a professor of historic preservation. He lived in Rhode Island. He had not seen his father, with whom he had a difficult relationship, in some time. He had no money to fight a long legal battle. He had a wife and children to think of. He had every reason to do nothing. He did not do nothing. He decided that the only person in the world who could save his grandmother was him, and that the only weapon he had was the truth. He started making phone calls. He called Annette de la Renta. He called David Rockefeller. He called Henry Kissinger. He told them what he had seen. They listened, and they each, separately, decided that they were going to help him. Chapter 10. The Grandson Who Filed the Petition. On the 24th of July, 2006, Philip Marshall filed a petition in New York Supreme Court that named his own father as the man harming his grandmother. The petition was prepared by his lawyers across the early summer of 2006. It asked the court for one specific remedy. It asked that Anthony Marshall be removed as the personal guardian of Brooke Astor. It asked that Annette de la Renta be appointed as personal guardian in his place. It asked that J.P. Morgan Chase be appointed as financial guardian so that the management of her assets would no longer be in the hands of any family member. The petition was supported by sworn affidavits. Annette de la Renta wrote one. She had been Brooke Astor's closest friend for 30 years. She described in detail the changes she had observed in Brooke's surroundings and in the access she was being granted. David Rockefeller wrote one. He described conversations with Brooke and his concerns about her care. Henry Kissinger wrote one. He described the same. The papers were filed in the morning. By the afternoon, the New York press had the story. By the next morning, it was on the front page of every New York newspaper. The New York Daily News headline was the most direct. It described the allegations as a son keeping his mother in disgraceful conditions while looting her fortune. The New York Times put the story on the front page within 48 hours. The international wires carried it. The European press carried it. The press coverage was not survivable for Anthony Marshall. He retreated to a press statement saying that the allegations were the work of a disgruntled grandson and that everything had been done with his mother's best interest in mind. The senior figures of New York public life made the press statement irrelevant by the weight of who they were. Annette de la Renta did not lie. David Rockefeller did not lie. Henry Kissinger did not lie. The court would not be able to dismiss the petition as a family feud. On the 8th of August 2006, the New York Supreme Court Justice John Stackhouse issued his order. Anthony Marshall was removed as personal guardian of Brooke Astor. Annette de la Renta was appointed in his place. J.P. Morgan Chase was appointed as financial guardian. The Manhattan District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau, opened a parallel criminal investigation that same week. Brooke Astor was moved, with her docks in Boise, from the Park Avenue duplex to Holly Hill, the country estate in Briarcliff Manor. Christopher Ely was rehired. The medical care she had been denied was restored. The food, the heat, the bed linen, the gardens, the phone calls. Her closest friends came to see her. Her best friend Annette came every week. She lived another 12 months in those conditions. She was 104 when the court order was made. She was 105 when she died. The records of those last months show a woman who could no longer hold a conversation, but who responded to music and to her dachshund and to the smell of the gardens. She died at Holly Hill on the 13th of August 2007. She was buried at Sleepy Hollow Cemetery at her own instruction next to Charles Marshall. Her grandson had given her the last year of her life back. He had also opened the door to the longest criminal trial in the history of the New York Supreme Court. Chapter 11. The longest criminal trial. In New York history. It would take 5.5 months in a Manhattan courtroom and 12 days of jury deliberation to convict the 85-year-old son of the woman who had given New York its libraries. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office had spent 2 years building the case. The indictments were returned in November 2007, 3 months after Brooke Astor's death. Anthony Marshall was charged with multiple counts of grand larceny, scheme to defraud, possession of stolen property, offering a false instrument for filing, and conspiracy. Francis Morrissey was charged with conspiracy, scheme to defraud, and forgery in the second degree. The trial opened in the Manhattan Supreme Court in late March 2009. Justice Kirk Bartley presided. The prosecution case took months to put on. The witnesses included the doctors, the household staff, the nursing staff, the former butler Christopher Ely, the forensic handwriting examiners, the forensic accountants, and a series of senior figures from New York public life who took the stand to describe what had been done to their friend. Annette de la Renta testified. She described in plain language the deterioration she had watched and the difficulty she had had in seeing her friend. Henry Kissinger testified. He spoke briefly but with weight. Philip Marshall, the grandson, testified. He took the stand against his own father. He had not seen his father in any sustained way since the petition was filed. He described what he had seen in the Park Avenue duplex in the summer of 2006. The defense argued that Anthony Marshall had acted at all times in the belief that his mother wanted him to take care of her financial affairs and that the codicils reflected her actual wishes. The defense argued that the dementia had not been as severe as the prosecution claimed. The defense argued that Francis Morrissey was a competent estate lawyer who had drafted the codicils in good faith. The defense argued that the forensic handwriting evidence was open to interpretation. The jury was given the case in late September 2009. They deliberated for 12 days. They went back through the documents. They went back through the testimony. They asked the judge for clarification on points of law. They returned their verdict on the 8th of October 2009. Anthony Marshall was convicted on 14 of 16 counts. The convictions included first-degree grand larceny, second-degree grand larceny, scheme to defraud, possession of stolen property, offering a false instrument for filing, and conspiracy. Francis Morrissey was convicted on 5 of 6 counts, including conspiracy, scheme to defraud, and forgery in the second degree. On the 21st of December 2009, Justice Bartley sentenced both men to 1 to 3 years in state prison. Anthony Marshall's lawyers appealed. The appeals delayed his surrender for 3.5 years. On the 2nd of June 2013, at the age of 89, in declining health, the decorated Marine, the former intelligence officer, the former ambassador to 3 countries, the Tony Award-winning Broadway producer, and the son of Brooke Astor reported to the Fishkill Correctional Facility in upstate New York to begin his sentence. He served approximately 8 weeks. He was granted medical parole on the 7th of August 2013. He had dementia. He had congestive heart failure. He went home to die. He died on the 30th of November 2014. He was 90 years old. He was buried quietly. Charlene survived him. Chapter 12. What Old Money Always Wanted. The libraries got their $100 million back, the charities got their lost endowments, and somewhere on a shelf in a closed apartment, a torn nightgown was being folded by a stranger. The probate dispute that followed Brooke Astor's death lasted nearly 5 years. The 2002 will and the 3 codicils were litigated in surrogate court, while the criminal trial moved in parallel through the criminal court. After the criminal convictions of 2009, the position of the codicils became untenable. On the 28th of March 2012, the parties to the probate dispute reached a global settlement. The 2002 will was accepted as the valid instrument. The 3 codicils were thrown out. Approximately $100 million that had been redirected away from the charities by the codicils was returned to the charitable beneficiaries. The New York Public Library received its bequest. The Metropolitan Museum of Art received its bequest. The Pierpont Morgan Library received its bequest. The Bronx Zoo received its bequest. The smaller community organizations received what had been intended for them. Anthony Marshall received approximately $14,500,000 in cash and property under the 2002 will in the settlement. Charlene Marshall received the necklace, the pair of earrings, and the 2 fur coats that had been made for Brooke. The fur coats had been cut for a woman of size 6. Charlene was substantially larger. Brooke Astor had made her last public statement from beyond the grave, and the message was the one she had wanted to send for 20 years. The Park Avenue duplex at 778 Park Avenue was sold in 2012 for approximately $21 million. The art and the jewelry and the furniture were auctioned at Sotheby's in September 2012. The sale realized approximately $18 million. The proceeds were distributed in accordance with the will. Holly Hill was sold. Brooke Astor is buried at the Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Sleepy Hollow, New York. She is buried next to Charles Henry Marshall, the second husband, the great love of her life. She is not buried next to Vincent Astor. Vincent is buried elsewhere. She made the choice. It was her last small piece of editorial control. The deeper story the case left behind is a story about who old money is for. Brooke Astor had not been born into the Astor fortune. She had walked into it at the age of 51 through a marriage to a difficult and unhappy man who died young. She had spent the next 48 years giving the money back to the city that had built it. She had genuinely believed that the inheritance was hers only on loan, that her job was to return it to the libraries and the children and the shelters and the gardens of the city that had paid for it in the first place. She had not been corrupted by the fortune. She had used it. But she had a son. And the son had been raised in the shadow of the fortune. He had grown up watching his mother give to strangers. He had spent 80 years waiting for an inheritance that, in his understanding, was supposed to be his. He had served his country. He had won his medals. He had earned his titles. He had built a respectable life. And in the silent ledger he kept of what he was owed by the woman who had given him to her parents in the summer of 1930, the inheritance was his last unpaid debt. When the dementia came, he reached for it. He fired the butler. He turned down the heat. He refused the safety gate. He wrote the codicils. He took the $60 million from the libraries and the museums and the zoos. He paid himself the salary. He bought the yacht. And the woman who had given $200 million to the city of New York spent her 104th year on a torn couch in a stained nightgown in a room that smelled of dog urine while her son sat in the next room and worked through her files. What this story reveals about old money is the part nobody likes to say aloud. The corruption does not live inside the founder. The corruption does not live inside the giver. The corruption lives inside the person who is waiting to inherit. The longer they wait, the more the corruption grows. By the time the dying matriarch is finally weak enough to be taken, the person who is going to do the taking has been rehearsing for 60 years. Brooke Astor restored the New York Public Library. She rebuilt the Astor Court at the Metropolitan Museum. She fed the homeless in the Bronx. She walked into soup kitchens in East Harlem and asked the managers what was needed. She wrote her own letters. She knew her own staff by name. She lived for 105 years. And in her final winter, she lay alone in a cold apartment in a torn nightgown, while the man she had brought into the world stood at the window of the next room and counted what he believed she owed him. That is what old money looks like when no one is watching. That is what the libraries do not put on their plaques. I will keep digging out the stories the families of old money have spent generations burying. If you want to see the next one, subscribe. And tell me below, who is the family member in your own life or in a story you know who never recovered from waiting too long for someone else's death? I read every answer.